Thank you for listening to the Daily Devo. My name's Pastor Stephen Maccabee. So thankful today you're along for the journey. Things can't get much worse, can they? But oh wait, yes they can. Matthew chapter 24 verse 15 is pretty clear. When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, and that's what we're seeking to do, understanding what the abomination of desolation is all about. The prophet Daniel, who's referenced here by Christ, used that term 3 different times in his book that bears his name. Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, Daniel chapter 11, verse 31, Daniel chapter 12, verse 11. Daniel mentions the abomination that causes desolation. It's book based on his description. What we know is exactly what this event's all going to talk about when Jesus brings it up in Matthew 24. So as you study these verses alongside of each other, I want you to keep in mind what biblical prophecy often says. There's a present fulfillment close to the prophet, and then there's a future fulfillment that's out. This is what the theologians sometimes call as the law of double fulfillment. That is, the prophecy is fulfilled in a relatively close proximity to that prophet, and then there's a greater fulfillment that's out in the future, and so there is then a double fulfillment. So when Daniel spoke about the abomination that causes desolation, he was referring to an event that would soon take place from that moment in time, and history will show us that that has happened and that did happen, and still there is yet another fulfillment that's coming in the future. Because we read what Jesus said. He used it as an example there in Matthew chapter 24. So the first event happened. The second event that Jesus referenced happened in 70 A.D., and that's where a lot of my preterist friends get hung up. They get hung up on that 70 A.D. But remember what Daniel said in chapter 11, verse 31. His armed forces will rise up to desecrate the temple fortress and will abolish the day of sacrifice. Then they will set up the abomination that causes desolation. Antiochus Epiphanes is a man in history that I want you to learn about. Nearly every Bible scholar identifies that prophecy as a desecration, that abomination of desolation that was committed by Antiochus, I'll say it right in a minute. He was a Syrian king who ruled over Palestine from 175 BC to 165 BC. And he turned Palestine into a surrogate Greek empire. His name was Antioch the Great. But he began to reference himself as Theos Epiphanes, which means the manifest of God. Isn't that interesting? He believed himself to be God on earth. But his enemies who watched his life referred to him as Antiochus of Epiphanes, which means a madman. Isn't that interesting? So we believe, as we read history, he died in 163 BC, totally out of his mind. He was outraged to the point he was in a complete state of madness. He experienced many defeats at the hands of Jewish rebels, particularly under the leadership of Judas Maccabeus. Now that's interesting to me. I'm a Maccabee. So Judas Maccabeus. Daniel 11:31 foretold the time when the king would pollute the sanctuary, take away the sacrifice, perform a total act of repulsion inside the temple. And that would be hard for us to understand if God in his wisdom had not given us insight into studying this man of history, Antiochus. And so Antiochus, as you look at his life and you begin to pull insight out of what will happen when the Antichrist emerges, Daniel prophesied, Jesus picked up on this, and he's looking forward as he looks backwards. And so what happened with Antiochus? Well, it's important. Josephus tells us that he was overcome with violent passions. He made the Jewish families keep their infants uncircumcised. He made the capital a crime to circumcise your boys, so you would be murdered. Moms caught circumcising their kids would be thrown over the city walls and plummet to their death. Antiochus stopped the sacrifices, and then he sacrificed a pig on the altar of God. He killed both male and female Jews. He looted the temple of anything of its value. He stripped the temple down. Eventually, he had the temple rededicated to Zeus. He forced the Jews to eat meat sacrificed to pagan gods. I mean, the list goes on and on. Any Jew who refused to eat the pork that was sacrificed in the temple, then they too would be jailed or killed or burned at the stake. The synagogues, the Jewish schools were closed. All of this was in an effort to just take control and just put their foot on the throat of the Jewish people. Anyone found worshiping on the Sabbath was arrested. Antiochus ordered Hellenization of the Jews, which meant that the Jews were turned into Greeks. Antiochus attempted to put all visible expressions of the Jewish faith to an end. And so all of these, they were just burning through the city like a dry forest fire. Everywhere they looked, they were forced to make decisions that would go against God, their faith. They were put to death. And all of these Jewish people were forced into pagan practices. It was a really horrible time. The Greeks were shocked when they found a group of people willing so strong in their faith, and they fought back. There were those who were conformed to their demands, and yet there were those who stood up against their demands. And many of the Jewish people, they fled to the mountains. They lived in caves for protection. Others were martyred for their faith, and yet there was some with a strong devotion to God and a strong devotion to the law of God. But Antiochus sought to destroy everything, and actually, in essence, there was a uprising that would be his demise. And so, even though there was a lot going on, a lot of the Jewish people responded exactly opposite of what Antiochus wanted. Though they were oppressed, though they were uprooted, though they were persecuted, there was a rediscovery of their Jewishness. There was a resolve in their passion, and yet it was a terrible time. It was a suffering time, and yet this man named Judas Maccabeus led a revolt. So think about this. He was a Jewish zealot. He was not about to sit down and let Antiochus destroy the nation. He put together a small army. They lived in the mountains. They ate whatever they could find. They were hiding in the hills. They were loyal to God and loyal to his law. They descended upon a town, pulling down the pagan altars, circumcising the children, and they were doing anything to stamp out what the Syrian king had done. It was reported that Antiochus, he set a well-equipped army to destroy this mercenary force, to destroy Judas Maccabeus, and Judas met the army. And even though they were poorly trained fighting these professional soldiers, Judas led this ragtag force to victory. God blessed them. Antiochus sent a larger army with guerrilla warfare and armies, and they began to try to enslave people. But Judas Maccabeus defeated that larger army, and they were recapturing city after city, village after village. He removed all the pagan altars. He eventually cleaned and rededicated the temple. He restored Orthodox Jewish practices to the temple people and for the people in worship. And even today, Jews celebrate Hanukkah as a reinstatement of their Jewish religion under Judas Maccabeus. His family, they were captured, they were martyred, but even his martyrdom and even their lives spurred the people on to greater victories. What a devotion! What a thought!